Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Evan Kirk. I'm a Senior Project Director at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina. We are working with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of Maryland on this webinar today, the EFC Integrated Planning Peer-to-Peer Exchange for Municipalities. And you'll see that there's a mix of municipalities, state permanent authorities, and private consultants and NGOs on the call today. And hopefully we have a good conversation. So I'll just get quickly into the agenda. So we're going to start with a quick introduction from Robyn Deyoung at the EPA. She'll talk for 5 to 10 minutes. At that point, we'll have two presentations, one from Errin Kemper at Springfield, Missouri, and one from Megan Muir at Burlington, Vermont. And then at that point, we'll have a 10-minute, or I guess 15-minute Q&A. And then we'll take a quick 5-minute break, and our IT professional, Paul Bonner, at the School of Government is putting everyone into breakout rooms manually. And Paul will open the breakout groups at 3 o'clock, and everyone will be automatically assigned to a breakout group. You do not have to click anything to join. And we'll go into those breakout groups for 40 minutes. We have in those breakout groups a note taker. We have a facilitator, and we have a panel, 1 to 2 panelists. And you selected in your registration which breakout group you prefer to be in, and we did get everybody their top choice. So you'll be automatically assigned to your top choice. And we ask that you participate as much as possible in that breakout group to make the conversation fruitful. And we can learn a lot from what you have to say, and you can learn a lot from each other. And then after that, the breakout groups will automatically close. We'll come back to the main group. You don't have to click any buttons. You'll automatically be reassigned to the main group. And then we'll debrief for 20 minutes where the facilitators will talk a bit about what we talked about in the breakout groups. Just quickly, I'd like to, they're not going to talk immediately, but I'd like to talk a little bit about, just to give a quick introduction to our panelists today in the plenary session. Megan Muir has been at the Water Resources Division, and she's been the director in Burlington, Vermont since 2016. Burlington provides drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater services to 42,000 people, annual budget of about $17 million. And then prior to serving as division director, Megan was the city's first program manager of the Burlington Stormwater Utility, and that was launched in 2009. And Megan holds a BA from Rice and a Master's of Science in Water Resources Management from the University of Vermont. And then Errin Kemper is the director of the City of Springfield's Department of Environmental Services, Springfield, Missouri. In his current position, Errin oversees all aspects of the city's sanitary sewer system, the stormwater compliance program, and the city's integrated solid waste management system. And Errin enjoys working with members of the community on environmental issues. And Errin is a 2002 graduate of the University of Missouri Science and Technology, and has received a master's degree in civil engineering with an emphasis in water resources. And Erin's a board certified water resources engineer. So really looking forward to hearing both of them talk and volunteering their time to have some fruitful conversation today. And then the breakout groups, as you saw on the registration link, are barriers to getting started, adaptive management, plan implementation, stakeholder engagement, and affordability. And I'm sure we'll get the question of, will these slides be shared? Will a recording be shared? We will share the recording to the plenary session on our website, and I'll email all the registrants with that information following the webinar. And we will share the notes from all the individual breakout groups. The breakout groups will be recorded, but we will not share those recordings publicly because we want to encourage you all to participate. And if you say something in the breakout groups that you don't want necessarily to be shared with the general public, but you want us to know for our purposes as we develop resources for integrated planning, then feel free to say that. The note taker can jot that down, and we won't share that publicly. But to the extent that we can, we're going to take notes as best we can and share those notes publicly for all to see. And then the breakout group debrief will be recorded and shared on our website. So with that, I'd like to introduce Robyn Deyoung at EPA. And Robyn, I'm stopping sharing my screen now, and you can feel free to share yours.
Great, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Robyn Deyoung, and I wanted to give you a quick introduction before we get started with our excellent speakers today. I'm very excited today. I'm the Integrated Planning Lead at USCPA in the Office of Water, and it is my pleasure to introduce you and give you the welcome. I first wanted to thank Evan Kirk at the University of North Carolina EFC for hosting us today. And we've partnered with the Environmental Finance Centers of University of North Carolina and University of Maryland to give some technical assistance and help us educate municipalities and do types of events like this so that you all can really learn and talk to each other, and we can learn from you to find out what exactly you need when it comes to integrated planning. And just in case there are some new people in the audience that isn't completely you wanted to get a little bit of an update on what integrated planning is, I thought I would give a quick overview. So integrated planning is a voluntary approach for municipalities to meet Clean Water Act obligations. And that could be done by sequencing wastewater and stormwater projects. And the goal is to help municipalities maximize their investments through those sequencing of projects to achieve the greatest human health protections and environmental outcomes under the Clean Water Act. And that approach could include innovative things like green infrastructure. And the whole idea is to make this a comprehensive analysis of alternatives. So you can include stakeholder engagement, there's adaptive management, and the things that integrated planning is not, though, which many people sometimes ask, is integrated planning does not change regulatory standards. It does not remove obligations to comply with the Clean Water Act, and it does not weaken existing permitting limits or requirements. And what's really nice about what happened about 2 years ago is the Water Infrastructure Improvement Act. That is a law that came out in January of 2019. And in that law, it actually codifies the 2012 integrated planning framework that EPA developed in the Clean Water Act. So it's still a voluntary approach, but now the integrated planning has been dropped into the Clean Water Act. And so there's even more certainty that integrated planning is an option for meeting the Clean Water Act and other clean water goals. So I know there's, we really want to get to the speakers here soon. So I'm going to shift over to one important map that I wanted to show you. And this gives you a sense of all of the integrated plans that are happening. These are the completed plans that have been either incorporated into a permit or a consent decree, or plans that have been developed and a permit or consent decree it might be pending or under negotiation. And we had to do this for the report to Congress. The Water Infrastructure Improvement Act also required EPA to develop a report to Congress. And what we did is we looked all across the US to see who has developed an integrated plan that looks at stormwater and wastewater, or sometimes it's a sequencing of many wastewater treatment plants. And we've now have that in a report that has been sent to OMB, and we're hoping that that will be ready for the public very soon. And we'll have profiles of all of the integrated plans and the development of those for the municipalities that are in orange star here on this map. And then the last thing I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of is through our partnership with the Environmental Finance Center, we are providing free technical assistance through August of this year to state permitting authorities who are reviewing plans and to municipalities such as yourself who are developing an integrated plan, and maybe you need some help with thinking about alternatives analysis under element 4, or you're thinking about how can you do the sequencing, or how could you pay for all of the projects, or maybe the affordability analysis. So you could contact Evan and Ellen Kohler, and that they'll help you out with what you might need through these office hours that we have partnered with the Environmental Finance Center. So we really hope you'll take them up on that free technical assistance that's available. Great, so I'm gonna stop sharing my slide and turn it over to Megan, who will be our first speaker.
So thanks very much. Yeah, my name is Megan Moir. I am currently the division director for the Water Resources Division in the city of Burlington. And as you'll discover today, we're pretty close to either the end or the start of the beginning. I don't know exactly how to frame it, but we wanted to share some lessons from our process that we've been undertaking for a number of years now. We are still in a pandemic, and so a little bit of humor. Today's pandemic presentation is brought to you by the tardigrade or water bear, which is one of the most resilient creatures on the face of the planet. So if the tardigrade can be crushed, deep frozen, dried out, shot into space, and still survive and even reproduce afterwards, I know that we all can get through both the pandemic as well as if you are pursuing an integrated plan. So as Evan mentioned, I live in and work in the city of Burlington. It's a pretty small city, though it is the largest city in Vermont of about 42,000 residents, and we have about 10,000 water wastewater connections. Our water system and works have been around for many, many years, reaching back to 1867 when the city purchased the Burlington Aqueduct Company. And then wastewater came in around in the 1950s, and then our youngest of the three siblings is the stormwater utility, which was formed in 2009, and that's when I joined the city. Like a lot of cities, particularly in New England, we have a number of Clean Water Act requirements. I'm just going to switch to the sub-watershed map. A phosphorus TMDL was issued in 2002. In 2011, the EPA rescinded the approval and kind of sent everybody back to the drawing board. And as part of that going back to the drawing board, the requirements for municipalities, and particularly Burlington, coming out of the revised TMDL were pretty expensive on the phosphorus side, covering both the wastewater sector as well as our treated combined sewer overflow system at the main plant, and also pretty heavy reductions on the stormwater side, ranging from about 20 to 24%. On the wastewater side, our current permits, which are at the 0.8 milligrams per liter, were being squeezed down to the 0.2. We also, around the same time, were facing the revision. I think the original one had been in the 1990s, kind of in line with the EPA, a revision of the Vermont combined sewer overflow rule, which was issued in 2016. And then we had been struggling for a while with another TMDL. I think we're the only community in the nation that still has a stormwater impaired flow-based TMDL, which is really looking at the impacts of urban runoff on the change in the flow regime in urban streams. And that had been issued in 2007. We certainly had done a lot of planning, project identification, had done a little bit of implementing of retrofits, but that was kind of lingering over our head. And as with many of you, beyond any of the new regulations, one of our biggest challenges is just a plain, simple infrastructure deficit. We've got old everything. We've got, wastewater pipes that were built in the 1800s, lots of water pipes. We have stormwater pipes, which may be newer, but of course, people selected in the 1970s and 80s and 90s when they were doing stormwater separation, they decided to put in corrugated metal. Corrugated metal does not do well, as you might expect, with salt water, which is what we essentially create in the wintertime when we're trying to keep everybody safe from sliding off the road. Water Resources has had stretches of fiscal years without any rate increases, which of course has contributed to not being able to replace things. And really there was kind of a lack of comprehensive reinvestment planning until just recently, in the past couple of years. So when we were faced with this, and at the time I was on the stormwater programming side, kind of looking up at my director at the time, and we, were really kind of scratching our heads and doing a little bit of a freak out. What do we tackle first? Which strategy is the best? And how can we possibly stay compliant, let alone afford all of the separate regulations and deadlines? And so that kind of led us to IP. I don't think it's any surprise to any of you that, typical state clean water programs, not because of any fault of their own, just the way they've been structured, are very siloed with wastewater, combined sewer programs and stormwaters. Even if they're in the same watershed office, they are generally different people, different work groups. And we really liked the appeal when we read the integrated planning memo of putting everything literally in one basket, your stormwater regs, your wastewater regs, your CSO regs, and then also being able to include asset management, simply taking care of the existing stuff that you have. So we kind of call it Captain Water Quality Common Sense, this approach of picking the projects that are going to have the most impact in the shortest time, and then potentially drawing out the full implementation of all of your regulations over a longer time period. Some of the other drivers that really pushed us in this direction, were there was a report that estimated the cost of our phosphorus upgrades at the wastewater treatment plants was going to be $31 million. A lot of money for, going from pretty good performance to just that next rung of performance. We actually benefited from an EPA technical assistance grant in 2014, gave us about $25,000 to work with Tetra Tech to kind of just dip our toe in the water and start exploring this approach. And overall, it went really well, and it was really well received by both people in the city as well as people at the state. Our state Vermont DEC has been really supportive. They wrote a great letter of support for that technical assistance grant and have been sort of regularly checking in with us and us with them over the course of this project. We also were able to access healthy clean water SRF planning subsidy, which brought down the total cost of this pretty substantial planning project to something that was acceptable. I will admit that at the time, because of my stormwater-centric focus, there was a lot of stormwater sort of nerd bias. I was really intrigued by the possibility that instead of spending $31 million at the wastewater treatment plants, was there a way of pushing the phosphorus optimization train, right, at the plants, chemical optimization, and then spending all of that money on the stormwater side, presumably, for projects that might have larger community benefits. That was sort of the hypothesis of whether or not we could do that. We were also very interested in the financial capability and probably more importantly, the affordability, because those are kind of two separate things, right? Financial capability is more of a formulaic approach prescribed by the EPA, whereas affordability is really like, can our ratepayers afford this, these projects? And then I think we were also really intrigued by, we are really intrigued by the concept of, the end of the Golden Brick Road, this concept of an integrated permit, that instead of having what sometimes feels like 15 different pieces of paper, having one piece of paper or one set of probably multiple pages of paper that kind of points out our direction for where we want to go. So kind of getting into the successes, I'm going to start with, where we're at right now, which is we are very close to, like I said, the start or the finish. Maybe it's the start of the end or the end of the beginning, where we have come up with a number of different strategies which meet all of our Clean Water Act obligations. We've had a series of technical sort of pre-submission check-ins with Vermont DEC, and everything has gone pretty well. Everybody's been generally supportive of where we've landed. And the interesting thing is where we've landed, kind of to get back to that question of my stormwater bias, we've calculated that the ultimate load reduction that we need is about 1,100 pounds. And we've looked at a number of different strategies. All of them, there's not really any much alternative. There's alternative analysis, but we have to do the CSO mitigation. We need to implement our flow restoration plan projects, and we have to stabilize a number of outfalls that are in serious disrepair. The differences really come down here at the bottom below those portfolio numbers about how we're tackling the phosphorus part of the TMDL. And so if we need to get that 1,100 pounds, what we found is that there is very much a path moving forward where if we implemented dry weather tertiary treatment, so disc filters at just the main plants, we would actually be able to greatly exceed that phosphorus loading reduction target, by more than double. It does happen to be the most cost-effective approach as far as capital costs as well as annual O&M. On the flip side, we looked at this the sort of concept that I have, which is looking at phosphorus optimization and then trying to put everything into the stormwater basket. And the end of the story is it is possible. There is a strategy which gets us above our phosphorus loading reduction target. The challenge is it pretty much requires us to do almost every single opportunity that we found for stormwater retrofits on both public and private property, and extremely expanded non-structural programs like leaf litter collection, fertilizer bans, all these sorts of things that ultimately would be pretty challenging to implement and very challenging to sort of, or I guess we feel like it may be challenging to sell to the state that we're going to be able to do that with enough margin of safety. And I'm just, something's, okay. The other challenge, or actually that was a success, getting into the challenges, I would say timing. The phases of the integrated plan and sort of where we started back with that 2014 EPA's technical assistance grant, which I would call the getting to know you phase. The fact that, I started the project when I was a stormwater program manager around 2016. And then that exact spring when we were sort of preparing and moving in that direction, the division director of 30 years left. So then I had to go about learning a whole heck of a lot about wastewater really fast. We were under a lot of pressure to figure out our wastewater treatment plant plans and permits because of permitting pressures. A lot of the permits in Vermont had been under administrative continuance since the early 2000s. And there was more and more ratcheting up of you got to get your permit sooner rather than later. And so that caused us to go fast. On the flip side, the state was sort of building the stormwater regulatory framework as we were trying to advance our project. So it was a little bit of the, we didn't want to get out too far ahead of them, but we were trying to advance the project. Somewhere along the way in 2019, the CSO rule got turned into an actual 1272 order, which kind of formalized and compelled us to then submit a formal long-term control plan. That wasn't part necessarily of the original IP. Certainly considering what we were going to do for the combined sewer overflows was 100% part of the plan, but needing to actually do that long-term control plan and the additional analyses had not been. So then we had to do an amendment and add more. And along the way also, just this is kind of back on the asset management piece of it, the main wastewater treatment plant in 2018 had multiple system failures, which called permit violations. And so, that was certainly distracting. The end of the story is it took a lot longer than anticipated, for about 4 years versus about 2.5 years, which is what was planned from the official start. And, there were several sort of lull periods in which we were either waiting on, our consultants were waiting on us to have bandwidth, we were waiting on the state to figure out exactly what they needed to do, and so on and so forth. So another challenge, which is maybe a hidden success that when I looked back as part of preparing for this presentation, is that our original scope of work, we kind of put everything in the kitchen sink in there. And I don't know that it was necessarily a bad idea, but I do scratch my head at the end of the day because we did a whole heck of a lot of separate stormwater retrofit planning and analyses around non-structural practice feasibility, kind of in parallel with the wastewater analysis. And at the end of the day, the way it's looking is that a lot of that stormwater work isn't necessarily going to be implemented, or at least isn't going to be, we're hoping it doesn't get written to a permit because we've ultimately determined we don't need to do it to meet Clean Water Act obligations. I kind of hoped, or I kind of wish looking back that maybe I would have recognized the difficulty of relying on chemical optimization at a wet weather influenced plant earlier on. But then there was that tension with the fact, this price tag that had come from the state of $31 million. So I think, one thing to consider, and I can't quite see the bottom of my slide because of Zoom, but, just kind of considering the expense and difficulty of the whole thing. I think at the end of the day, we've likely landed in an easier spot because it was always going to be hard to convince the state to do more stormwater instead of wastewater. Wastewater is so quantifiable, so measurable. There's a lot more confidence in doing reductions at the plant. So kind of in the same line with that, and I only got a couple more slides, one of the challenges was potentially, we ended up with a really large multi-firm integrated planning team. So we've got Hoyle Tanner, which was the prime, and they've done a great job. All these consultants have done a great job, but there were a lot of them. So Hoyle Tanner was managing sort of the wastewater piece and the overall project. ACOM was focusing on the H&H modeling and the combined sewer overflow piece. Stone was doing a lot of the separate stormwater planning and modeling and GIS analysis. Birchline was helping us with our public engagement. Horsley Witten group with Rich Clater. The god of stormwater was, or I guess demigod of stormwater, was doing a lot of the retrofit evaluations. And then Waterstone Engineering with Rob Rosine was helping us with the non-structural treatment practice analysis. It was a really long, detailed, I would call it gnarly scope of work from the beginning, which included that stormwater bias. And then we had to even add more later on. And I guess if I was to do it over, which I'm not planning on doing, you know, it would be to potentially plan multiple contract phases with off ramps and maybe take smaller bites at the apple, and make sure that I prepared the local approving boards for sort of multiple amendments. It's possible we might have saved a little money or time or spinning of wheels. It's hard to know, you know, going back in time. One of the pieces that I attribute our success to is the fact that Vermont is very small and interwoven, and we have a lot of great professional relationships and trust. Both myself as well as another person on my team actually previously worked for Vermont DEC. And in fact, even one of the original integrated planning consultant team members actually ended up leaving their firm and going on to become the secretary of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. And you know, she really believes in integrated planning, and we're hoping that that cascades down to the rest of the staff, which we have seen. As I mentioned before, we saw early support for integrated planning as a cost-effective approach, you know, to all these big challenges, particularly for Burlington. And we think that it kind of goes both ways. We believe that the state sees that we've demonstrated a proactive approach and a pretty quick response to issues. We're one of, actually don't know how many stormwater utilities there are, but at the time we were the second stormwater utility. We were really successful in telling the story of why we needed more money for the 2018 wastewater stormwater bond vote, which was in response to some of those permit violations. And we're really able to get a huge vote of success or vote of confidence from our citizenry. You know, to be determined. So I am trusting my colleagues at the state. We don't know yet where we're going to land on the integrated permit versus consent decree discussion. I believe that since we're being proactive, we should be allowed to at least try the integrated permit process and not have to land up immediately in a consent decree process. And the other piece that I don't really know where we're going to land is that there isn't a clear picture of exactly how we're going to be finished, quote unquote, with our CSO controls. Vermont's pretty strict in that they pretty much in the law says you never can ever have one. But obviously that brushes up against reality. And so right now we're pursuing a five-year level of control. The other piece is that we successfully conducted public engagement in a pandemic. We tried pretty much every possible method because we didn't want people to say that, you know, they were distracted and that they didn't have the opportunity to engage with this project since we were, you know, in the last year of rolling it out before we gave it to the state. So we did a number of things. We had online interactive, you know, remote meeting workshops. I think one of our most successful things was that we did a postcard to every mailing address, which we also translated, which announced pop-up events as well as a survey. The survey got a decent response. Almost 1% of the city responded. And, you know, the pop-up events were great. There was about 100 people who showed up, you know, very small. It was an awesome opportunity to go over the storyboards, which covered the alternatives that we had developed. And then also to have just conversations, whether it was about IP or just people's questions about water in general. And with that, there's a couple pictures of some stormwater BMPs in the city and me set up on the Burlington bike path trying to catch anybody who would talk to me about water quality. I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Megan. We really appreciate that. And again, we'll have a Q&A following Errin speaking. So with that, Megan, if you stopped sharing your screen, perfect. And at this point, Errin, if you want to share your screen and talk for a little bit, we're looking forward to hearing you speak.
All right, thank you very much, Evan. All right, can you all see my screen?
Looks great.
Perfect. All right, so I'm Errin Kemper. I'm the director of the City of Springfield's Department of Environmental Services. So Springfield, Missouri, a little bit of background, is the third largest city in the state of Missouri with a nighttime population of about 160,000 and a daytime population approaching about 300,000. But before we get into the details of our integrated plan, I'm going to kind of start by providing maybe a big picture context to how we got here, maybe even on a national perspective. So if you go back about 50 years in American history, we're in the 1970s, and there were several big legislative efforts to address pollution in the environment. And so you had the formation of the EPA, you had the Federal Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Air Act, as well as lots of rules governing the disposal of solid waste and hazardous waste. All this was great. And in the last 50 years, we've seen some pretty dramatic changes in the quality of our natural resources, both locally and nationally. And so here you have one example locally. This is our own Wilson's Creek, which is downstream of our largest wastewater treatment plant. If you go back to 1970, it was awful looking. But compared to today, it's an amazing natural resource that our citizens enjoy. But there's a problem with a lot of these environmental regulations, and it's that as we've progressed as a society, we find ourselves taking a disorganized approach to environmental stewardship. And so as regulations evolve and enforcement increases, communities like Springfield face an overwhelming economic burden to comply with the rules. So this is an enormous issue for communities like ours who are struggling to meet these regulations with limited resources. EPA realized this and in 2012 released their Integrated Municipal Stormwater and Wastewater Planning Approach Framework, which is a mouthful, but it emphasized a commitment to work with states and localities to develop local plans that they could use to prioritize their investments across stormwater and wastewater. So in response to that, the City of Springfield worked with two of our partners, Greene County, Missouri, and City Utilities of Missouri, which is our local utility provider. And we proposed a local approach to integrated planning. Now, what we're trying to do is create a framework that allows us to look at the big picture to ensure that our finite resources are being applied where they're needed the most. And so at its core, it's a way to prioritize environmental investments based on 4 key factors. We want to assess our community's priorities, identify and prioritize both the most significant problems, as well as the best solutions to those problems. And we want to do all of this in the context of our community's financial capability. And so over the last 7 years or so, we've invested some significant time and energy in bringing our community together to better understand our region's needs. And we've done a lot of technical research to trying to understand how different pollutants and different pollutant sources are interacting with the environment. But in the end, when you get past all the technical stuff, we're really trying to answer one big question. And that is that if we only had $1 to spend, what would we do to invest in what matters the most to our community while addressing the most significant problems, using the most effective solutions in a way that is affordable to our citizens? So there's a lot to this plan, and I would encourage anybody that wants to learn more to go to www.springfieldintegratedplan.com, and we've got quite a few more details out there. But today, what I kind of want to do is just highlight some of the lessons that we've learned and then talk through some of the regulatory challenges where we've had some success through our integrated planning efforts. So if you look at one of these kind of lenses that we prioritize through, it's capturing our community's priorities. And so in the early years of our integrated plan, we formed a community-wide environmental priorities task force. And they gave some great insight into where the community feels we should be making our environmental investments. So we're here in the heart of the Ozarks, and this is a region that values its water resources. So it was no surprise that water was a primary focus of our citizenry, and that protection of our drinking water supply was their #1 priority. This was a really good thing to know and to hear our community say out loud, because it's not that clean drinking water supply is the only factor that we should consider, but the more we can align the investments that we're making with our community's top priorities, the more we can start to build support for some of our programs. So then we kind of step off to the side and we start to look through one of the more technical lenses. And this is identifying the most significant sources of pollution. And so to do this, we took a very technical look at some of the different sources of pollution in our region. Over a period of several years, we pulled together stakeholders that came together and identified the most significant sources of pollution. And so with the help of HDR, we assembled a team of national experts. We held a number of workshops, and then we prioritized these sources in a multiple criteria decision analysis toolset, which sounds kind of fancy, and it was awfully complicated. But what it did was it provided a very objective view of each of the different types of pollutants and each of the different sources, and tried to link them together and prioritize them. And so you'll note here is a kind of a prioritization list of the top 16 sources of pollution ranked low to high. One thing I'll point out here, because it's going to be relevant later in the presentation, is that agricultural runoff and urban runoff were 2 sources that had a very high priority, but for different reasons. And so agricultural runoff has the potential to create excess nutrients which has the potential to impact our local drinking water supply, which of course is the #1 priority. And so it received a lot of weight as a pollution source. Urban runoff, on the other hand, had a wide variety of pollutants attributed to it. And so it affects a wide variety of beneficial uses. And so for that reason, it was listed as a high priority source. So this has also been a very helpful process to get us kind of to the point where we can make better decisions when it comes to environmental investments. One of the next things we looked at was identifying and prioritizing the most significant solutions. And so we looked very closely at the relative cost benefit of different solutions using a sustainable return on investment approach. So this is a triple bottom line analysis that allows us to make apples to apples comparisons between different investments in different sectors. So, how do you compare a wastewater treatment plant improvement to a rain garden improvement? They both impact water quality, but what dollar for dollar are you getting for each one of those? And so through this process, we were able to lay out a dozen or more of those alternatives and learn a lot about them. You'll see a couple of pictures here of two things that floated to the top of that analysis. One of them was riparian corridor restoration, which had a very high benefit cost analysis. And the other one was water quality education, which you also get a lot of bang for your buck in that. So let's talk just a little bit about some of the challenges we faced and how we've used our integrated plan to some success. And so the first one that I imagine a lot of you all are dealing with is the city's amended consent judgment. And so we're under an amended consent judgment to eliminate sanitary sewer overflows in our system. And through our integrated planning, we've been focusing on optimizing our investment to get the highest net benefit for the money that we put in. And so these efforts have led Springfield towards prioritizing projects in public use areas like parks and neighborhoods. So we're trying to reduce SSOs in the areas where the SSO has the greatest impact. And it's also really opened the door to green infrastructure projects that our studies have shown provide a greater net benefit in water quality. So if you look back in history a little bit, in 2015, we developed our first overflow control plan in response to our consent judgment. It was unique based on our integrated planning in that it represented a phased approach to addressing SSOs. So initially the city committed to 10 years worth of investments with a focus on adaptive management. And so while we check our assumptions and try to identify the best strategies, the idea is to go through an iterative process to constantly be refining it. And so now we're about 5 years into this 10-year plan, and we're currently working with the state of Missouri to supplement this plan based on everything we've learned to date. I'll say that this has been much more effective than trying to commit to a long-term plan that makes less and less sense as every year goes by. So we've had a lot of success through integrated planning and making sure that our overflow control plan is sized right to get the maximum benefit for our community. Another kind of unique success story of our integrated plan is our clean pavement initiative. And so Springfield has several urban streams that are impaired due to PAH compounds in the sediment. And for many years, our community contemplated the idea of a coal tar-based sealant ban. But as you can imagine, the proposal was controversial. And so through our integrated plan, we were able to show that the choice to use an alternative sealant resulted in a positive overall benefit to the community. And so that's when you capture the water quality benefit, the economic benefit, the social benefit, all of that turned out to be positive. And so we approached our community with the Clean Pavement Initiative. And under this program, homes and businesses can voluntarily pledge to use only asphalt-based sealants when they resurface a parking lot. And they receive recognition by the city in the form of a sign and some presence on our website. And so we've gotten voluntary participation from many of our local businesses and institutions. This includes 2 of our major hospitals, a lot of our bigger businesses in town. And we've even gotten support from the sealant applicators in our community who have committed to providing alternative sealants to their customers and then educating their customers about those sealant choices. And so our hope here is that we can make progress on addressing those stream impairments voluntarily before needing to come in and implement and enforce new regulations. It's a lot easier to go under your own terms than it is to go under someone else's. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about a future opportunity that I think really highlights what integrated planning is all about. So I know that most of you aren't familiar with our topography, but here you see the city of Springfield and the upper James River watershed, which is just upstream of our city limits. And so this is mostly an agricultural watershed, which in Springfield, Missouri means a lot of pasture and cattle farms. But the lower portions of this watershed lie within the Springfield urbanized area. And so you'll note on this map that the city's primary drinking water source is located within this watershed. And there's a lot of other people that use the watershed for a lot of things too. There's a lot of floaters, a lot of swimmers, a lot of fishermen on this watershed. So from an integrated planning perspective, this is a great opportunity to collaborate on a solution. So here's some of the things that it's got going for it. Inside this watershed is the community's #1 environmental priority, and that's protection of our drinking water supply. It also has a number of top-tier pollution sources. So you remember the chart from earlier, 2 of the highest tier pollution sources are agricultural runoff and urban runoff. And so if we could wave a magic wand and eliminate just one source of pollution, there's a good chance it ought to be one of those 2 because they have the biggest impact on what we're trying to achieve. Also note, when we talked about some of the most effective solutions to environmental protection, repairing corridor restoration was one, and one we didn't mention, but has a very high benefit to cost ratio, and that's cattle exclusion from the stream. And so we know this is a good area to address. We know that it's got some of the highest priority pollutant sources to address, and we know that some of our solutions are those that yield us the biggest benefit. Add that all together, we also have affordability concerns through a TMDL. So the James River currently has a TMDL, and there are a lot of different partners putting a lot of different money towards trying to address that TMDL. So I guess what I kind of want to point out here is that when you look at just this watershed, even not knowing anything about Springfield, Missouri, and knowing that there's a TMDL in place, one thing you'll notice is that a lot of the folks that are making investments towards environmental protection are doing so downstream of the community's #1 priority, which is our drinking water source, which really begs the question, is there any way that we could shift some of those investments upstream of the drinking water source to better align our investments with the community's #1 priority, and maybe even be able to do that with a greater net environmental benefit at a lower cost? And so I throw this out there as just one example of what I think the future of integrated planning could look like. This is clearly an opportunity that checks all the boxes, and if you add it all up, it creates an opportunity to do just what we've been saying that we wanted to do, and that was invest in what matters the most to our community while addressing the most significant problems, using the most effective solutions in a way that's affordable to our citizens. And that's all I've got for today. Thank you all.
Wonderful. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat box, and it may vary who would like to answer them. The first one is, can you distinguish between integrated planning and the One Water framework promoted by the U.S. Water Alliance? I don't know, Robyn, if you wanted to take a crack at that one.
Yes, I can do that, no problem. So I would say that the One Water approach from the U.S. Water Alliance and EPA's integrated planning approach does have many similarities. Both the integrated planning approach that EPA's developed, our framework, and the One Water approach, our goals are to involve stakeholders, think holistically. We want to have a revitalized community. We want communities to be resilient. We want them to think comprehensively when looking at clean water. Now, One Water is looking at valuing any type of water system, whether it's drinking water, clean water, water reuse, water source protection. And so I would say that approach is much broader than EPA's integrated planning approach. Our main focus is stormwater and wastewater projects, sequencing them, and being able to look at the best bang for your buck, and also, you know, getting the water quality improvements as quickly as possible. But just like Errin talked about in his presentation, communities and municipalities can consider other priorities such as drinking water. They can look at climate resiliency. They can look at environmental justice and things like that. And so that can be a consideration within your integrated plan. So it's just not the primary focus, but you can expand it if you want to.
Great. Yeah, and Adrian Namura in the chat provided a very similar answer. She said, One Water is focused on treating water as a resource and planning for its long-term use in a sustainable manner, while integrated planning is intended to prioritize municipal stormwater and wastewater projects towards compliance with the Clean Water Act in a way that is affordable for your municipality. So two very good answers there. And just a reminder, if you have questions, please raise your hand or type in the chat box with your questions. I don't see anyone with their hands raised, and I don't see any further questions in the chat box. So we can, oh, here's a question from Pinar in New York. Would integrated planning affordability analysis allow to look at the drinking water and Superfund expenditures to be taken into account while utilities submit integrated planning? And just to provide a little bit of background on that, I actually had a conversation with Pinar a couple weeks ago, and she was concerned about additional costs that aren't related to the integrated planning projects, but are a burden on the ratepayers. So can Megan or Errin, did you take into account other costs that your citizens face besides the projects within your integrated plan?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that was very important. So when we did our financial capability assessment, we looked at all of the other asset management stuff, all of the just general renewal replacement that we need to do at the plant of the existing infrastructure, the collection system, the outfalls. And so that was in our sort of base calculation of what our ratepayer burden was. And then we added the new stuff, meeting the new regulations on top of that. We haven't explicitly included the drinking water costs in the financial capability assessment, although I think it's sort of like as a sidecar, because it's all the same ratepayer in Burlington, and so you can't really just look at how it's going to be burdened on the clean water side. I think it needs to look at all of the stuff we have to do for water for renewal replacement. And the other thing I will say, and maybe somebody has an answer to this, one of the things that we kind of struggled with in the FCA was how to deal with the stormwater portion, because the old financial capability calculations from the EPA, you know, there were no stormwater utilities, and so how do you account for the ratepayer burden in stormwater? We figured out sort of our approach, but it didn't seem like there was a prescribed approach like there is on the wastewater side, where you look at the residential equivalents, blah, blah, blah.
And I'd say it was very similar in Springfield. Every time we've kind of dove in and talked about affordability in any one of these areas, we've made it very clear that you're dealing with affordability on the same ratepayer. And that's been easier when the three organizations that are involved in integrated planning represent pretty much all of the government utilities and organizations in the area. And so if you're paying a utility bill, you're paying it to one of us. And so we do quite a bit of looking at what are each one of those individual costs associated with each one of our individual environmental mandates, and how do those stack up. But for the most part, we've achieved most of our benefit by just being able to point out amongst ourselves and to others that if you increase it here, that's only going to create more of a burden over in this area too.
That's very true. Trent mentioned that EPA's new affordability framework, he's referring to the 2020 FCA draft, which has not been officially accepted by EPA. It went out to public comment, has come back, and they're deciding whether or not they want to edit it and send it back out. Brings up additional opportunities to consider other water-related costs. And then I would add Superfund in DEP's case. So Trent would add it to the metric for that respect. And we'll talk about this a little bit in the affordability breakout session, hopefully, and we can provide those notes to folks. I saw Lisa Brown mention, she had her hand raised initially, and she mentioned, are there any examples of multi-municipal approach? I don't believe that the Burlington or Springfield case is multi-municipal. That may be something, Lisa, that we can talk about a little bit later as we further our discussion that we've started. So thank you for the question. Robert Cox says, Megan, the $31 million for the wastewater treatment plant upgrades to get 0.2 total phosphorus. What is the wastewater treatment plant at now? 0.5, 0.3, 0.1?
Yeah, so the permit is at 0.8, but we've certainly been performing better. What I was just typing this. I'm kind of interested to unpack where the old cost estimates came from, because where we've landed with our sort of current preferred portfolio is to go down to 0.1 at main plant. Main plant currently on average with optimization, because we've been pushing that the hardest there, is about 0.28, and it would involve disc filters, cloth disc filters. And the cost estimate, the current cost estimate for that is nowhere near the original 24 million. They said for that plant, we're coming in around 7 million. So, you know, it can show you how one piece of data can point you in a certain direction. And so I don't know if that answers this question.
Yeah, and I think
the smaller plants are around, I think, the 0.4. They're performing more consistently around the 0.4, 0.5 range.
Okay. And I think they'll be talking about that a lot in the adaptive management breakout session, where you change your approach based off of new data as it comes in, potentially in the plan implementation as well. Are there, Jennifer Robinette asks, are there any utilities that have successfully used the integrated planning framework to address just multiple competing wastewater compliance requirements and not wastewater versus stormwater? Jennifer, the answer to that is yes. There's a couple of folks on this call who have that. Johnson County, Tammy Lorenzen from Johnson County will be leading one of our breakout groups, and Johnson County has that type of plan. They're addressing competing wastewater requirements across their municipal service area, in this case a county, but that's defined as a municipality by EPA. So yes, an integrated plan can still be integrated if it only addresses wastewater requirements. Sharam asked, is integrated planning best applied to combined sewer systems, or can separate sewer systems benefit from this approach? Errin, yours is a separate sewer system example, is that correct?
Yeah, so we're a separate sewer system, and integrated planning has given us the ability to try to leverage in some green infrastructure component to our overflow control plan. And so I remember 10 years ago when we were getting into our consent judgment, as a separate system, green infrastructure just wasn't an option. And so over time, we sat there and we look at fairly expensive wastewater improvements being scheduled that have, well, I don't want to say relatively minor, but relative to some of the stormwater expenditures that we could make that were causing big improvements in water quality. We never had the ability to combine those two things, but now we find ourselves through integrated planning able to do some of those stormwater projects in lieu of some investment in the wastewater system for an overall bigger net benefit. So definitely can do it as a single system.
Perfect. And Christy Williams of ERG posted a memo from the EPA. There's a link there, and we'll save the chat, so we'll share any relevant links to the registrants link there about how the financial capability assessment applies to integrated planning. Thank you, Christy. Adrian Namira posted an example regional plan, so that addresses Lisa's question. So that's excellent. I'm going to download that and take a look at that, Adrian. Thank you. I think that I've addressed all the questions that have come into the chat. If you continue to have questions, please send them in the chat, or you can certainly email me directly, and we'll make sure that all the questions that have gone unanswered today are answered. And at this point, well, thank you so much for speaking, Errin and Megan. They're going to be leading or co-leading some of our breakout groups. So you may be assigned to their breakout group, and we certainly appreciate their time today. And we will take a quick break, and we'll come back. At this point, Paul will initiate the breakout groups, and we'll come back. Let's say instead of 3 o'clock, let's come back at 3:05.
legwork up front if you don't know that it's ultimately going to be approved by the regulatory agency. And so some of that early chicken and egg dance, I think, has been a challenge for some of the communities that have gone this route. Trent suggested that having some sort of MOU with the regulatory agency can be really helpful in managing expectations on both parts and really identifying roles and responsibilities along the way. And so that might be.
Can you define that real quick for folks?
Having an MOU, having a memorandum of understanding between the two. I apologize for the alphabet soup world that I live in and speak in. Yes, having some sort of memorandum of understanding between the agency and the jurisdiction or jurisdictions to really lay out roles and responsibilities and make sure that everyone has the same set of expectations of one another moving forward. It was also suggested, there was a good bit of discussion about how integrated planning can play into existing long-term control plans and consent decrees, and the ability to reopen those to using an integrated planning approach, but also the double-edged sword of reopening those and perhaps having other voices in the mix as that gets reopened. There was some interest in thinking about how drinking water can get incorporated into these integrated planning efforts. Had some questions around where to start and what kind of authorities need to be in place. And I think the answer was it looks a little different for every community moving forward, and depending on what they're trying to accomplish, what their priorities are, what their drivers are. And then there was some interest in, and this might be something, Evan, that we as the EFCs might want to follow up on, because I'm not sure it really got fully explored, is this idea of multi-municipal efforts and what the credit sharing in those situations look like. Councils of government that are representing multiple jurisdictions, and what do those types of models look like? So that might be something where we could do a little digging and provide some more information to folks. And then also the delicate balance of wanting to use an adaptive management approach, but also having language that is strong enough that the regulatory agencies are feeling comfortable that this is going to meet regulatory requirements. And Trent had suggested that action plans on a shorter time cycle within the longer integrated plan might be one method for being able to marry that delicate balance between adaptive management and having something that really is comfortable for the regulators.
Great. Ellen Kohler, Adaptive Management.
So we had some similar topics come up in our group as well, frankly, although Johnson County Wastewater District, which Tammy gave us a wonderful outline of where they are and in terms of their overall plan, but also with respect to adaptive management. What was interesting to me about what you commented on, Tammy, was that you're actually also coordinating with 16 cities around their stormwater management. And so while this wasn't an example of a multi-municipal integrated plan, it easily could become one because of the overlaps in terms of what they're doing for wastewater, their own stormwater obligations, and the area that they serve, which includes a whole bunch of other cities. In terms of the adaptive management, part of what we were talking about was the sort of the different timelines that people can have, or municipalities can have, depending on what states you are in. Kansas has a situation where a permit can't extend beyond 5 years. So that can affect the way that you want to shape your integrated plan. Nonetheless, they had a phased approach, which included a little more than a year. And then so they could collect some additional information and then kick into the next phase. So that's something to consider as well, is, what can you do initially without collecting data, and what could you then maybe do, during that first phase, or to collect some additional information to be able to pursue that adaptive management, thinking about whether those metrics that you need to be looking at and what's going to be important for that process. We also had some conversation around, you know, frankly, around the affordability piece, and that did flow over into what other those 16 cities were looking at in terms of the costs that they were experiencing. We were just getting into this question about how to address a change of standards during an integrated planning process. You know, whether that's something that the integrated planning process can actually help address, as opposed, you know, if it's already in a compliance document and that standard changes and it actually would have provided the community with a little bit of relief, is that something that could actually be realized in an integrated planning setting when it couldn't be realized in a different compliance structure? And so that's something I think, again, the EFCs, as Jen mentioned, that's something I think we should be following up on in a conversation with EPA.
Thank you. Christian Lutz, plan implementation.
Yeah, so our group spoke, we spoke a lot about, you know, the plan implementation process, which kind of covers sort of the adaptive management portion, but one of the biggest themes that we kind of ran into was your relationship with your state agency. And, you know, we had Errin, Kemper, and Kevin both gave some great insight to this. One of the biggest things was to get in early with your state agency and do so often, which, you know, that might include some presentations and education. I know Kevin said that, you know, and within their state agency, one of the guys that he was working with was a wastewater guy, so didn't really know much about stormwater. So there may be some education portions of that to take into account when you are talking to your state and looking at that relationship. It seems some states are more educated on integrated planning than others, but overall, it's really good to go ahead and get in a good relationship with them and keep in contact so that you're consistently letting them know. And in a number of cases, when you are going through your reevaluation of your projects, making sure to include and update them so that they can be involved in the process. And one of the things that we looked at was kind of after the fact, when it comes to implementation, what were some of the biggest lessons learned? And, you know, one thing was collaboration is key to integrated plan. You know, using a more structured approach is better. It's always best to be proactive in the manner instead of reactive. A lot of the times communities may just try to put out fires and so, but a more proactive approach was better, and something that even Errin said that, you know, if he had to redo it again, he would definitely do so with a more proactive approach. And Kevin let us know, you know, adaptive management is a key part. He really wanted to outline that, you know, instead of committing to this long project list of on down the line for a number of years, it's better to be adaptive and pick and choose along the way. So there were some of the big points within our session. We also discussed environmental justice and how that kind of plays into implementation.
Great, thank you, Christian. Robyn, for stakeholder engagement, Robyn Deyoung.
Hi, yeah, thanks. We had a great group. We had Grace LaRose from Richmond, Virginia was our panelist, and she kicked us off talking about stakeholder engagement. And, you know, I could break this up into the when, the how, and the who. And it was recommended to include stakeholders at the very beginning of the integrated planning process. And Grace said she even started with the state to talk to them first, to let them know what their intentions were and get feelers out there on how their acceptance would be and what their goals would be with an integrated plan. And many other of the people who talked, like Susan from Johnson County, said she started with the state as well. So that was definitely recommended. And then keeping stakeholders involved all the way along throughout the process. In terms of other people who should be involved. We talked about the environmental foundations, nonprofits, any underserved communities, and so that you could address any environmental justice issues, and even the general public, as well as having people who are very interested in the technical part of it, the businesses, the private businesses as well. And then the how was a big piece, because there were some people who were just getting started with their integrated planning. And Grace talked about third-party facilitation was very helpful in having constructive conversations, so that it's not just, you know, the public coming out and making it a complain fest. It's there's a focused and discussion, and it helped build trust among many of the, you know, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, some of the other environmental groups that were a little bit hesitant at first. Social media has been really helpful in getting the word out to the general public. There's even a suggestion of pop-up street events where you just pop up in people's neighborhoods and provide educational information about what the integrated planning is, how that's happening, and how they're trying to clean up the waterways. Tours of the wastewater treatment facility has been really helpful in educating the public, because we talked about, you know, there's really a two-track educational component. There's the technical folks that talk TMDLs and all of that jargon, and then there's the quote unquote, Grace called regular Joes, or the public, who need a little bit more basic information on what's happening. And so having that bifurcated stakeholder outreach strategy has been really successful for these communities. And storytelling, videos, trying to get art and music involved is something that Mary, who's working with Lancaster, talked about to really engage the community. So those were the things that that we discussed, and I thought it was really informative to share that information across the municipalities. Thanks, Evan.
Great. And I was a facilitator for the affordability breakout group. Our panelist was Sonia Brubaker at EPA. Sonia started off by mentioning that she works generally kind of with the question of the methodology of the financial capability assessments. So for those who may not be familiar, the financial capability assessments are a series of memos. First one in, I guess, kind of a more informal one in 1995 for water, 1997 guidance that uses the residential indicator, which is the metric that we may be most familiar with, which is basically the start of the percent MHI affordability look. And then there's a 2014 memo, and then there's a 2020 guidance that went to draft, came back to public comment, and it's back with EPA, which they're still working with. Sonia talked about how their approach is a national approach, and some of the challenges of that national approach. Certainly, when you're trying to come up with a metric or a set of data that might be able to allow you to assess the affordability for ratepayers of administrative orders. That it's very difficult for one metric to work for every single municipality throughout the country. And then, sorry, I said 1995 guidance. There's a 1985 water quality standard guidance. So one of the questions was kind of the difficulty of using percent MHI for specifically urban centers where there might be a disparity in income between the highest income group and the lowest income group, and sort of the difficulty of, you know, if you have pockets of lower income communities, saying that the water might be affordable overall because you've got some higher income people in your community. How would you look at what the challenge might be for your lowest ratepayers? And New York City specifically, this was brought up by Pinar at the Department of Environmental Protection at New York City. They're looking at the first and second quartile of ratepayers to see what the burden is on them. And a quartile, the first quartile is the 20th percentile income, that's 25th percentile income, which is actually saying that, you know, 75% of the people in the service area make more money than that group. So in 24.9% make less. They're looking to see what the burden is on that group. And she specifically named a couple communities where those ratepayers may be concentrated. So that's something that they're really concerned about. They're also concerned about the burden to the ratepayer of things that are not water and wastewater. Department of Environmental Protection at New York City has to deal with Superfund as well, and that's a burden to the ratepayer that's not water and wastewater. So how does the FCA guidance, how does EPA look at, and how does the state look at the burden to the ratepayer that's not water and wastewater? And the answer is that they're trying to bring in to the FCA guidance, and certainly what you can bring in whatever you want to your conversations with your state. Trying to bring in some other additional aspects that might provide additional context. And it may be a little less formal how those things are used, but certainly you should always bring those things up to your regulator when you're in the conversation about any sort of compliance schedule for any administrative order. Another question came from New York City as well, and kind of came about like, where did the 4.5%, 2% number come for affordability within the residential indicator? Sonia mentioned that those two are not looked at together. So even though the 4.5% might be the level for burden for the ratepayer for both water and wastewater, they still look at water and wastewater separately. So that was interesting. And then some other things. So there's a gentleman, Jeff Hanshaw from West Plains, Missouri, who brought up that they're just getting started with the integrated planning process, and what they have identified, which is kind of indirectly related to affordability, but isn't specifically related to the FCA, the financial capability assessment, is that they just identified a huge need in the community. So the huge need is part of what spurred them towards the integrated planning process. He mentioned $100 million need over the next 10 to 20 years for 12,000 ratepayers. So that's pretty daunting. Certainly the integrated planning process hopefully will help them be as efficient as possible as they're addressing those needs. There wasn't a whole lot of experience with FCAs within our breakout group, so we couldn't get too much into the specifics, but we did get into affordability in general. So those were all of the debriefing for the breakout groups. Again, folks, we will share the recording with all the registrants for the plenary session and for this debriefing session, and we'll share the notes from all the breakout groups. Feel free to reach out to either Ellen or me about any TA ideas that you may have or any need that you may see. We can get started with talking about anything with you, whether it's connecting you with your state, whether it's facilitating a conversation with your state, whether it's giving you some context of people that may be able to help you along the way, whether it's actually looking at your affordability assessment and helping you calculate some of those metrics for you. That's kind of a laundry list of things that we can do. And thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you so much to the facilitators and the note takers. Lots of knowledge that came to this webinar, and certainly it was wouldn't have been possible without you all, and we really appreciate that today. And please feel free to direct any questions to us by email. Put it in the chat box in the last minute here, and we're saving the chat, and we'll certainly be able to follow up with anything we haven't followed up with yet. With that, everybody have a great week.